Welcome in, everyone, to the newest episode of Hockey 101. Everyone's favorite deep dive show continues its strong success, moving forward with another week of incredible in-depth analysis, questions, and discussion. And we felt it was time to bring in a special guest. We promise special guests, and we always get a chance to talk to them behind the scenes. And everyone always so cagey with Bob Purowitz. So they want to be hidden from the boys. They want to speak their mind, but they never want to get on camera. Well, now we finally have a man brave enough, staunch enough in his opinions to put himself on camera with Bob Purowitz. And as we do with all of our new guests, I will let him introduce himself. Mark, tell the folks who you are.
Thank you, Lucas. Thanks, Bob. So Mark Purowitz, in and out of hockey. I recently retired as a senior partner with Deloitte. Deloitte is the largest professional services firm in the world, over $70 billion now in size. I was on the global executive leadership team for our mergers and acquisitions and private equity practices, working with clients on a global basis on deals. In the non-professional services world, I lead one of the two governing bodies for non-NCAA club hockey, called AAU College Hockey, which is principally on the East Coast here in the United States, with about 165, 170 university teams across men and women's divisions 1, 2, and 3.
Now, Mark, you share something in common. I don't know if you know this, but you share something in common with the actor/comedian Carrot Top. You're both chairman of the board. And I wanted to lead in with that just to make sure you know that just because Dan Kay might not be on the show yet, I'm still going to bring the whimsy. I'm still going to let you know that those jokes are going to be coming your way. Before I make another bad one, though, we got to introduce the man slightly next to me in our Zoom room squares. It's Bob Purowitz. Bob, welcome back to the show.
Unbelievable. Episode 8. Who would have ever thought
Who would have thought with Carrot Top jokes we would have made it?
I don't get Carrot Top. I usually get John Lovitz or someone like that, but not Carrot Top.
It's John Lovitz.
Number of viewers growing every week. We're having fun. Oh my God, it's everything we could have expected. And I'm really happy to have Mark in. I'm working with Mark, of course, with the AAU, the club college hockey level. And we're going to bring Mark back in to talk about club hockey in another episode when we talk a little bit about Tier 3 junior hockey. But for tonight, we really want to tap into his expertise from New York City and doing deals and talking about nil and talking about private equity coming in possibly to NCAA Division I sports. And so we'll do a deep dive on that to begin with. But I thought maybe we might take a look at a video before we get going from Kirk Herbstreit, who's one of the top guys broadcasting Division I football, and his opinions on what's happening. He's talking football, but he's really talking all sports. And if we could tee that up, we'll come back and we'll discuss it afterwards.
When I played, players had zero rights for the majority of college football. You just do what you're told, and it's like you're in the Marines. Yes, sir. You may have another kind of thing. And then we got to 2020 and COVID, and everything kind of changed. Then a realignment, and then we've kind of gotten into this world now where players are able to leave whenever they want to leave. We have NIL, obviously, that is a huge part of this. But if you even follow the NFL model, the players have restrictions. Like, you can't be on the Bears and just say, "Oh, the hell with this season. I'm going to the Lions." Like you have a contract. You have to follow the contract. The NFL has very stringent rules. This is what we do as a teams. This is what you're allowed to do. This is what the players can do. So this whole idea of the players in college just doing whatever the hell they want to do isn't the right thing. Like it's not like like my kids, I had 4 sons. If my kids at 12 years old said, "Dad, I'm taking the car, see ya, I'm going to a party," at 12, I'd be like, "What are you talking about? You can't do that." The world we live in today in college football, it's kind of like, screw you, I'm taking the keys. And the coach is kind of like, well, okay, he's going to take the keys. What am I supposed to do? I mean, you have zero power.
Okay, that's basically what we've been saying all along. Okay, and my premise all along was the NCAA needed to have some kind of certainty. I kept talking about cost certainty before private equity would come into the game. And then somebody with experience like Mark said, no, wait for a second here. Private equity is going to be a change agent. So, Mark, tell me why we disagree.
Well, there's parts that we agree and there's parts that we just have alternative opinions. I wouldn't necessarily call it disagreeing. We have different frames of reference. So I'm going to oversimplify this. So my friends in private equity, I'm sure, will come after me if they do happen to see this. But there are two fundamental models in private equity. And much like most investors, they look at assets in a portfolio. And the asset that they have versus the asset that they're looking to acquire needs to fit into a broader strategic thesis. And that thesis may be industry, it may be market, it may be a component of a value chain, whatever it is. And within that thesis, it needs to have some level of, as Bob, you called it, cost certainty or relevance associated with how the business is run. And then, as importantly, if not more, how the business grows disproportionately top line to that bottom line, right? Because that's where, private equity is looking to make money, is in the disproportionate spread of its cost model to its revenue model. And that's where this level of cost certainty comes in, Bob, to, your reference is, they create a set of boundary conditions within which to operate. And those boundary conditions are pretty stringent because they really want to grow the top line, because the typical length of time that they own the asset is about 5 to 7 years. So they want to make sure that there is a level of cost certainty within that model, whether they're growing inorganically or organically, in order to reap the return on investment, as well as grow the asset to the point where they can sell it. Because that's really when private equity makes its money on the exit of those assets. Because the majority of the partners in private equity have stakes in those funds that really only get paid out when assets are exited, right? In the opposite side of the conversation here, when you're entering new markets in this particular case, I would call it a recalibration. I wouldn't necessarily call it a cost certainty, because when you're entering a new type of a market, there's less certainty around what a cost base should be. So they're developing the thesis now. And within that, they're creating a set of boundary conditions within which to calibrate what those expenses should be relative to what they believe that revenue opportunity should be, right? So especially for private equity entering in these businesses, there's been the last 5 to 7 years with a number of those that have purchased major league franchises, whether that's here in the U.S. or in overseas in the professional football leagues, right? So there's precedent set in the way that private equity has looked at these types of assets out there. But there's also a good reason why each of the major professional organizations has a certain level of ownership percentage that private equity can have in each one of those, so it doesn't overly influence a particular model. I think that's likely going to be the case here in that precedent setting, and the way that private equity has entered into those professional leagues. I don't believe you're going to see any PE owner allowed to 100% own any asset, at least for right now, in collegiate sports. Some of the interviews that some of the private equity owners and current and previous billionaire owners of franchises in the professional leagues have said we're negotiating around 51%, in that. So it gives them some level of control, but not complete ownership. I don't believe the regulatory environment nor any of the school systems within their bylaws and constructs would allow for that to happen. But it gives them a level of ownership and the ability to invest. Because you have to remember that these are assets at the end of the day, whether you want to call them physical assets, human assets, whatever it is, they're assets. And private equity looks at these things as an asset class, right? So as the evaluative criteria that they're using is through that lens of an asset class, there's physical infrastructure. Many of these, let's say, Division I football organizations, and Bob, you called it the blue bloods versus the not blue bloods in Division I hockey, and you certainly see the spectrum of physical facilities in hockey, right? You know, the North Dakotas of the world versus others are drastically different. Same thing in college football. So there's going to be a level of investment required to build up physical infrastructure and the fan experience for these organizations, because you have rabid fans, and since many of these stadiums can only fit a certain amount, right? Not everybody is a Penn State or a Michigan, you know, where you can have 100,000 people in there, but yet many schools want to have 100,000 people, right? So there's going to have to be an upgrade of the physical infrastructure and the overall fan experience to enable that. Now, all of that has to be done within some kind of a cost model that supports this revenue growth and the asset appreciation over time. I think it remains to be seen whether or not private equity will choose this typical 5 to 7 year period, because we have not seen that yet in the professional league franchises where they've turned it over within that time period.
Why do you think that is?
Sorry?
Why do you think that is?
I think there's a fan and an emotional part of these that you typically don't see in the business world, where it's looked through the lens of a financial model and a return and things of that nature, right? You have very wealthy people who are fans of these teams. There's personal bragging rights. There's a lot of different things that they have that are intangible around these assets that you don't normally have when a private equity company buys a retailer or something like that, right?
In a typical deal, there would be no emotion, right? Mm-hmm. In a typical deal that you would have done in New York, there would be no emotion. The only emotion is how much money am I making, right?
Well, there's strategic emotion, right? So I have worked with private equity partners and company CEOs who fall in love with a deal, and they believe that the asset, regardless of the price, helps them propel their strategy or whatever vision they have. I have counseled CEOs and boards because they have gotten too emotionally involved to say that the ROI or the strategic thesis doesn't fit the financial thesis of that. Sometimes they do it, sometimes they don't, sometimes they rework it. But I have absolutely seen, private equity as well as company CEOs get emotional about deals. It's just a different kind of emotion relative to that. It's not a fan-based emotion. It is, hey, I think this could propel my vision or my strategy faster than I could organically.
Tell me, when private equity goes in and takes a look at an asset, could be a football team, a basketball team, could be a hockey team. Can their experts go in and figure out where or if there are revenue opportunities right away? Like, are these guys that good that they can just go like that and know what the ceiling is as far as revenue opportunities?
The answer is a qualified yes. There's very, very smart people in the private equity world, and they tend to look at revenue opportunities a little bit differently than those that are embedded inside of the business. They also live in a different ecosystem, right? So their networks, private equity is all about not only investing, but networks. And many of these private equity houses will have assets in many different classes and related sectors and industries. So they'll think of, or they'll have an opportunity to look at this type of investment through a different lens that might say, I can activate that part of the ecosystem and that part of the ecosystem that normally somebody who sits inside of, in this particular case, a sports asset may not even think or have access to in that regard.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about costs then. For private equity to get involved in this, the change agent that they would be is, I'm assuming that they would go to the NCAA and say, we're looking for A, B, and C to contain costs, right? For us to do a deal. Is that how it goes down?
I don't know in this particular case enough about the inside model about who would be the ones opining on that, right? Because the NCAA doesn't own the asset. It's really the school and the whatever state-based system, right? If it's a public institution versus a private institution, they're the ones that would set up or have the natural boundary conditions around what those are. I think the NCAA, and again, I'm only speculating here as a third-party observer, right, will have more of the governance around it, things of that nature, much like any of the major sports leagues will set governance and expectations, but it's really the owner with the asset and the other trading partner, right, negotiating around that.
But let's go back to what Herb Street was talking about, which is the portal, which you can go from the Bears to the Lions any second.
That's crazy. Yeah,
that is crazy. Okay. And then nil, where there's no restrictions on it. We talked about last week on the pod, Carson Beck and his Lamborghini and $1 million went from Georgia to Miami for $4 million. Private equity and negotiating would make sure that that was buttoned up, right? So that costs would not be able to get out of control if there was a deal done.
There are some very, very smart people in the world of private equity, and they would invariably figure out a way of creating some of that set of boundaries within a particular cost model. So to make this analogous, that any professional league doesn't have multi-year contracts, right? They only have a single year contract, and everybody is a free agent at the end of the season, right? And within that model, each professional league has either a cap or some level of franchise tax or things of that nature, right? If you go over it, so they're attempting to create some level of cost certainty associated with that in an effort to establish parity to some degree, right? Because you don't want the Dodgers and the Marlins, right? In these types of organizations. So I would suspect that it may not be at the beginning of stage one. Any new market entry or growth is in 3 stages, right? Where you go in and you create a market and you figure out what those conditions of the market is. The second stage is you start to stabilize and you invest in that market based upon those boundary conditions. And the third stage is that's when you really grow in that regard. So I suspect in stage one here, there's going to be a lot of feeling out of what those boundary conditions could be, because private equity will push. Any outside investor will push against any market that doesn't have a natural set of boundaries. So private equity here will attempt to create a market or a situation that benefits them the most, right? So that's where you have to have some form of counterbalance, whether that's the NCAA, the schools, the boards of regents, the trustees, whatever it is. And you typically have some very, very smart people on the boards of trustees of these universities who are in the corporate world, things of that nature. So I suspect there'll be some type of calibration exercise, but rest assured, private equity will push to create a set of boundary conditions that benefits them the most.
Okay, so let's talk about those conditions. Let's just say we get down the road and private equity gets involved with school X, which is a big time school. It doesn't have to be a big time school, but we're just going to say it's a big time school. And this big time school has all the sports. And there's two sports that drive revenue, football and basketball. Maybe there's one or two others that are past break even, and all the rest of them lose money.
Yeah.
Isn't it in private equity's nature in business to just get rid of the ones that lose money?
Not necessarily, because not every investment in private equity works out, right? Not every investment in venture capital works out. In venture capital, it's like 1 in every 20 investments work, and it pays for the others, right? Private equity is not that large of a spread because you're typically making more focused bets at much higher investment rates than venture capital. But you still are looking at things through a lens of a portfolio. The owners of the professional leagues, the majority of them, this is one asset in a portfolio of assets. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head as to which of the professional teams actually make money versus those who don't. But I will venture a guess that in the portfolios of these private equity and billionaires who own the professional franchises, if it doesn't make money, really, like they're relatively happy with it, because it's more of an ego investment at this point, a fan-based investment. They get to take the capital write-offs and the tax write-offs from the investment against some of the other assets they have in their portfolio. Private equity is no different, right? They know not every investment will be a hit or a home run. They have singles, doubles, triples, and home runs in private equity as well. So, they'll look at these things in that lens rather than an individual investor investing in one of these things.
But when they invest in this big school X, they know that the rowing team and the fencing team and all of these other teams are not going to drive money. If the school wants to protect those teams, doesn't that have to be part of the original deal?
100%. I mean, in any investment, there's a cost of doing business. The other thing that you also need to recognize is that all of these athletes are also fans of these programs, right? You do not want to disenfranchise your fan base because there's a force multiplier, right? Because these fans will talk to other fans, will talk to their families, et cetera, and then you have, a negative effect around that. And the other thing too is you got to remember these institutions are vying for new students every single year. If they disenfranchise the majority of the athletes of these other sports, you're not going to be at the top of anybody's list in going to these institutions, right? So, there's a much broader lens and a balance that have to be created here.
I knew I wanted to bring you on for a reason. Lucas didn't want you on. Dan certainly didn't want you on.
Well, here's the thing, because we get to sit in and we get to listen to these people who know so much more than we do, and we get to just sit back and learn. And if at the risk of oversimplifying it, Mark, it feels like what you're getting at is in this big equation that you've got, you look at something, I'll really simplify it here. You're at a restaurant serving toast and butter. The butter's the really expensive part of that. But if you cheap out on the butter, that's kind of missing the point, right? You're not really creating something that's sellable anymore. You're devaluing your asset by trying to cheapen out on it. So it feels like there is some motivation for private equity to, as you say, kind of make an ego investment. It's not just adding and subtracting companies.
So private equity as a model is an outcomes-based model, right? They get the lion's share of their payback is when they exit an investment. So if you look at this investment in a potential football, basketball, whatever team, right? In an outcomes-based way, you can look at it very singularly through the lens of a football investment, or as I suspect many of them will be smart. And Bob, going to your question about the rowing team and everything else, and my answer about bringing in students, if the investment in the football team, I'm just purely speculating here, raises the brand awareness of the school, which then allows the school to bring in a greater set of students at a higher tuition rate, and that's provable based upon the investment in the football team, I would suspect that any smart private equity partner would want a percentage of that, right? So, there's a much broader opportunity here than just in a particular sport.
And how do you feel that, and again, I'm asking you to generalize for an entire industry, so feel free to either step back from that or not, but you spoke very highly of the method that private equity uses, the process, right? Creating your constraints, analyzing what the projections might be, trying to figure out the boundaries within which that they can operate. Is this industry, the sports industry, a potential big enough mover and shaker where private equity might start to change and adapt the way they do business to account for this thing, which is a business, isn't a business, which is an asset, but also there's more to it?
Private equity has proven very adaptable over the years, especially those that start out in one sector that then migrate to another sector. I don't think this is any different in that regard, especially if this is going to have a longer time horizon. So you got to take a look at the way, private equity or any investor works, right? So in the world of M&A, you typically want to have, at least in Europe and the US and the way we think about it, are much shorter term time horizons to get synergy value and ultimately return on investment in about a 3-year time frame, right? The way that private equity or companies, investment banks looks at these models is typically in a sort of a 3-year, this has got to pay for itself, and now we're on real big synergy opportunities going forward. Asia, Japanese investors and things of that nature typically take a much longer time horizon, 10 to 15 years. So when you find that they buy US assets, they will tend to pay a greater premium than US or European because they take a much longer time horizon in evaluating return potential. But they all look for businesses that have a level of expense management, really good senior leadership, revenue growth, specialization in a market that throws off cash and dividends, things of that nature. So there's a lot of common characteristics here in this particular type of an investment if you're looking at it in a much longer time horizon.
Now, the last thing that I kind of have for you, originally it was a question. And originally the question was, in a world where I think sometimes private equity does get a bad rap in popular media, can the sports fan and private equity coexist? And it was a question because I think you've answered it. And for me, at least, getting the sense, the answer is absolutely. That yes, as fans of something that you hold near and dear, there's always a concern when something new comes through. But I think what you've kind of explained here is that there are a lot of really positive benefits for private equity to get involved, a lot of great ways they can get involved. The example that you gave about injecting new capital for new facilities, right? New facilities which can enhance the fan experience, which can recruit new and better players to make the teams better, right? Those big capital projects are always so difficult to get underway. That's why you see these little bits of improvement here and there, but you never really tackle the underlying issue, which a lot of times is these facilities, these stadiums, they're just old. They can't fit the modern fan. They can't fit the modern expectation, but to revitalize them, to basically replace them, takes a huge amount of capital. And you mentioned, I think rightfully so, that that's a really good spot for private equity to be.
It is. You have to recognize that most organizations live in a world of scarcity, and the scarcity is capacity, time, money, and people. Right. So when you live in scarce capacity across time, money, and people, and you look at it through the lens of a university, there's and let's assume for the sake of argument, there's a dollar sitting in front of you. There are an awful lot of hands looking to get a piece of that dollar. So, university is constantly evaluating that scarce resource capacity among a large number of things that they need to invest in, right? So, that's where they evaluate their costs versus their endowments versus the bonds, and things of that nature that they float to pay for these things. Outside investment doesn't work within those same constraints, right? So the scarce resource capacity that typically exists inside of a university construct doesn't necessarily exist in the same way when outside capital comes in, because that scarce capacity of outside capital is not competing with everything else that is going on inside of the university, right? So you have this outside catalyst, as Bob, you referred to them as early on in the conversation here coming in. You don't want the outside capital and the ownership to take, a total ownership because it's a school-based system, but enough where they could make these investments for the benefit of them and the broader institution, but you still have more of a balanced governance process. Take a look at Redbird Capital and some of the other ones that have made, very, very positive impact on sports. And there have been a number of others that have been created, using that same model. I think it's been, pretty positive in the world of athletics.
2 years from now, are we going to see private equity involved with an ownership stake in athletics in the NCAA, in your opinion?
Yes.
And will there be a lot of lawyers involved in this?
From many different sides.
Yeah. That's a little bit of a transitioning here, because I want to talk.
There's going to be a lot of bankers. There's going to be a lot of lawyers.
Right.
I have one other question. Can I design the first fan jersey for a private equity company when they get involved in sports, so we can start repping the companies helping our sports teams?
I want to talk lawyers. I want to talk specifically a lawyer by the name of Jeffrey Kessler. Lucas, you know who Jeffrey Kessler is?
I do know who Jeffrey Kessler is, Bob.
So he's supposed to be the largest antitrust lawyer or the best antitrust lawyer in the United States. He represented or he was involved in the Supreme Court decision with Alston. He was involved with Tom Brady, with Megan Rapinoe, and an old friend of ours, it looks like, just retained Mr. Kessler. And we're transitioning right now over into the USHL updates because, of course, Muskegon and Youngstown, I should say Youngstown, and an unnamed team, let's just assume it's Muskegon, have hired this gentleman's services because USA Hockey is kind of trying to stop those two teams from going into the OHL. I'll just read a little bit from the article that about 1 million people forwarded to me. Kessler confirmed with Sportico that he has been retained by Youngstown and another team from the United States Hockey League. In a phone interview, Kessler said, "It has become known that the Phantoms seek to join the Ontario Hockey League and have given indication of their intent to exit the USHL." As I read a little bit further on here, the USHL also no longer enjoys the NCAA eligibility advantage over the OHL and the WHL. So I read that second part because the USHL was the place to go if you wanted to play Division I hockey because it protected your eligibility, as we've talked about before. Now that the CHL market is wide open, we have seen players vote for what the best league is with their feet and leave the USHL and other leagues go to the CHL. And now we're seeing ownership try and do it. And USA Hockey is trying to block this. And Mr. Gunty, like the players, are voting with his feet, and in this case, his pocketbook, and kind of doing a 180 where he used to say that the USHL was the best junior league in America, in North America, and now saying that he is heading to what he really believes is the best league, which is the Ontario Hockey League. So there's going to be a legal battle here, guys. And Mark, I'm sure you've seen a couple of legal battles with your old profession. Where do you see this heading?
There's an offensive side and there's a defensive side. I absolutely do agree with your premise that people will vote with their feet. And when the market landscape changes and presents different opportunities, look at the point you were making before with the transfer portal. Now, I don't agree with many of those conditions that the players are using, right, to vote with their feet. But in this particular case, when regulations change and governance change and it opens up new market opportunities, people should be allowed to vote with your feet. And it's a natural reaction that we are seeing by USA Hockey and USHL to try to block that. Because I am a firm believer in the right for people to vote with their feet. And it is incumbent upon us to create those environments that people want to stay to do that, right? When those environments themselves are not enough for people to stay, then you start with the lawyers. And because it's a very defensive move in that regard, because people are now publicly stating that I would rather put my feet somewhere else. And instead of reconfiguring or reestablishing a base, and in this particular case, the USHL, as a premier mechanism, they're just voting in a way that brings lawyers in. Now, I don't know the contractual basis or the governance basis within the USHL bylaws or any form of contractual relationship where a USHL team is bound by certain conditions to that league that prevents them from going, and they're trying to get out of those conditions and therefore breaking contracts and things of that nature. So I don't know if this is contract law coming into play. I don't know if it's governance. I don't know if it, anything like that. I suspect there's a lot of different reasons. But, much like we've seen in our world, right, in USA Hockey versus non-USA Hockey, they tend to put up, many more, ways to stop things than attracting them.
I think as we've seen in football, as the teams have exited the Pac-10, for example, as this reshaping started, the contracts to the leagues started containing higher and higher exit fees.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't know what's in that paperwork and those contracts for those two teams in the USHL. I'm going to take a wild swing at it right now. Who would have ever thought that anybody would leave the USHL?
Mm-hmm.
And if the USHL has something in their documents that all of the teams have signed that they won't leave, or there is a fee to do so, somebody should be given a blue ribbon for putting that in those documents and having the foresight. My guess is nobody had that foresight because nobody would see that happening. They always thought they would be the fourth major junior league, and that this is more USA Hockey backing this up. because USA Hockey wants a competitive place for the national team to be able to compete in.
Sure.
Just a guess. Nobody knows, right?
But I mean, I think that is a reasonable assumption.
Yeah. Now, while all this is happening, guys, and Lucas, we've talked about the narrative here on every podcast. I give Glenn Heffernan a ton of credit. The USHL came out with something on their website. Now, we may consider it to be factual. We may consider it to be fiction, but he's trying to drive the narrative. And I'll just read a little bit about what they have on their website. As the United States Hockey League enters its midwinter board of directors meetings, oh, by the way, this is just an aside right now. My understanding, talking to people in the USHL, is that those two teams will not be at those meetings. Now, I don't know that to be a fact, but with the kind of, when you get lawyers involved, probably they're not going to be there. Okay, they say they don't want to be there. Why would they be there? The USHL is emboldened by the success of its alumni and players at all levels. And this is the kicker. With all 16 member clubs having signed their declarations to compete in the 25-26 season. Interesting. Now, you don't put that out there unless it's actually happened, right? And that could be a legal holdup right here. Did Youngstown, and if it's the other team's Muskegon, we'll just assume that it is. Did they sign something?
Yeah.
I mean,
it's still weird to say it that way. Can we all just stop for a second and admit that, like, that's one of those things where it's weird that you said that? Why were you so specific with that?
This whole situation is totally weird because within days of one another, we've got Kessler and lawyers going against USA Hockey and the USHL. And then you have the USHL coming out and saying it's kumbaya. All 16 teams are moving forward.
Obviously we have eyes and we have ears, and we can see that may not be the case.
Okay, let's talk to the guy who's dealt with more lawyers than all of us combined. Okay, you think just stating that all 16 member clubs is something that a lawyer would put in there, Mark?
Lawyer, PR person, right? I've seen really good crisis management people, create these types of narratives as well. Some on the advice of counsel, some not. So, I could see this both out of the PR playbook and some with lawyers as well. But I think it's very interesting that an antitrust lawyer gets involved in this type of a situation, right? Because you have to go back to the Ted Stevens Sports Act of 1979 that created the USOPC now, and the NGBs. USA Hockey is one of the NGBs. Each NGB does enjoy antitrust provisions, right? I think there is a question on the table whether the affiliates. I am aware of some court cases, I won't go into them here, that have challenged this notion of an affiliate, the districts, leagues, things of that nature, as to whether or not they are part of an NGB's declaration of being antitrust. And there's been enough conversation to suggest otherwise, because these are affiliates, they're franchises, they're something like that. They're not owned by, the NGB in and of itself to fit within that corporate structure. Again, pure speculation here in reading a lot of different things. I don't know that for a fact, but it is very interesting that an antitrust lawyer has been brought in, and I suspect purely, from previous conversations around other affiliates and districts have challenged this rule or perception, that's an angle that they'll go after in this particular case.
So if you go back to the Kessler article, it talks about the economics of the USHL could also face scrutiny. particularly with Kessler crafting the arguments, antitrust lawyer. Kessler has long maintained NCAA rules are problematic because member schools which join hands to restrain how they compete vary so widely, blue bloods versus non-blue bloods. The dynamic has generated market restraining rules that protect the weakest members. Some big-time colleges could and probably would pay athletes to enhance recruiting. However, NCAA no-pay rules protect colleges that aren't in a position to pay. If the USHL is structured, meaning some teams such as the Phantoms have the wherewithal and interest to pay players while others do not, Kessler might depict the USHL as a mini NCAA, a league where rules protect weak from the strong. The Phantoms might also assert the USHL and USA Hockey have conspired to deny Phantoms players, coaches, fans, and media partners a better place in the junior hockey market. Also, if the USHL uses what the Phantoms portray as a one-sided and non-negotiable deals to acquire market positioning, a potential antitrust claim could be strengthened. They picked this guy for a reason, to your point. Go back.
Yeah. I mean, it could be antitrust, it could be collusion, it could be, a lot of different things along that same vein. But it is, I think this notion of anti-competitive market is what's going to be challenged here.
And with any lawsuit, Mark, who has the deepest pockets, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of rich guys who own USHL teams, but are they gonna fund this? How deep are USA Hockey's pockets? I think the guy who's hiring Kessler and the second team, I know their pockets are really deep. So we'll see what happens. But I want to get back.
I mean, one of the issues here, Bob and Lucas, this is precedent setting, right? So you may see people not quickly coming to an agreement, whether that's contractual, whether it's monetary, right, so quickly on this one, because if they are allowed to do it, it will set precedent. And
you could have something called the Youngstown rule come out of this.
It'll open up the door for others.
But how is not precedent already set? USA Hockey has allowed 5 American cities in the WHL and 3 American cities in the OHL. I would argue, I'm no lawyer, but precedent has already been set.
Well, so there's USHL teams up there, right, under the bench. If I'm understanding you correctly,
there's there's franchises in the CHL that reside in America. All Murray Gunty wants to do, and another mystery owner, probably in Muskegon, has add 2 more. How can he be denied?
Yeah.
I mean, you got to imagine, Bob, that's, at least from my perspective, and I'm certainly the farthest thing from a lawyer in this Zoom room currently, but I can at least give you the non-lawyer opinion here. And I mean, from where I'm sitting, I look at what the Phantoms are doing. I look at what the mystery team is doing, and I got to agree with both of those organizations here. The landscape has shifted so tremendously, so fundamentally, that the market forces that were in effect when the Phantoms signed whatever they signed, or when the Phantoms continue to operate, are no longer existing. The walls are down, right? Everything is completely open right now. And I think for USA Hockey and the USHL to throw up this arbitrary wall, and arbitrary is a word I'm definitely choosing on purpose, it feels like a last-ditch effort of sorts. It feels like they are trying to set their own precedent by not allowing teams to move. But the bottom line is, if Youngstown wants to move, Youngstown should be able to move, right? That is me as a sports person looking at the environment. The environment should be allowed to reshape itself. If Youngstown used to believe that the USHL was the best North American-based junior league, that's probably because they were. They no longer potentially are, with the way the rules have changed. And now Youngstown wants to continue to compete in what they now believe is the best North American junior hockey league. So they should be allowed to do that. And truthfully, the more we've discussed this topic, Bob, I think it is the right move for Youngstown and the second team. I think it's a great opportunity for them to continue to do that. We've mentioned about the deep pockets of some of these owners, where a quote from a previous episode you said, Bob, is, I want it and I don't care how much it costs. Right? That is the message that you're getting from some owners in certain areas of the country. Well, you're looking at a lawyer in Kessler. I believe this article quotes it as someone of his stature, billable rate, and fame. Right? So I want it and I don't care is the mantra. And unfortunately, when you want to set precedent, when you want to go up against an institution like the USHL, like USA Hockey, you just need to not care what it costs you. You just need to want to win. And I think for Murray and the Youngstown Phantoms, this is something they want to win. And from my perspective, I think they should win. I think they should be allowed to move.
Unless there's something in the governance documents.
Well, yeah, but I don't do contracts. That's for you guys.
No, but that's the point. I do agree with you in a free market system, vote with your feet, but within a set of boundary conditions. And if the boundary conditions here are a combination of governance, regulatory, and contract that neither of us have insight into, I think that's what it's likely going to come down to. Because if those two organizations did not have those constraints, they'd already be in those leagues, right? So there's some kind of constraint that is holding them back, whether that's governance, bylaw, or contract.
I think it's the governing bodies. USA, that's what it is. It's the IHF and the governing bodies.
I do have an interesting question, though, that I would like to get both of your opinions on because of Mark, especially your expertise here. Does the fundamental changing of the marketplace, could that have any effect on nullifying or weakening any contract language that was signed? Could you make the argument that what is now is so far away from where it was that this agreement is non-functional? It can't be applied.
Not really. Contracts are written in a way that their language is both general and specific to certain times and markets. That's why you see now in certain laws that get changed, and something that was illegal under a prior law that is allowed now, like they don't allow them to go back and change it because that situation happened in that point in time in which it took place, right? Same thing happens in contracts here, unless there was a provision in the contract or there was language in the contract where the regulatory environment has changed dramatically here. And the reason that language was in there was specifically for a regulation that no longer exists. Yeah, I think those things can be challenged in that regard because you can state that the context of that particular language no longer applies because what it was covering no longer applies, right? And again, I'm not a lawyer, but I've negotiated enough of these things to see that happen.
I'm with Mark, and I'm just going to say the rest of this letter on the USHL or story on the USHL website from January 27th is all factual. In capital letters, more than 195 USHL alumni were listed on NHL rosters. They go into Macklin Celebrini and Adam Fantilli and Jeremy Swayman. They go into our league provides the resources, structure, and competition necessary to develop the next generation of NHL stars. This is a testament to our unwavering commitment to being the preeminent leader in the hockey world. That was 23-24. I mean it. Unless I'm not going to be proven wrong, they're not getting Celebrini. Their NHL numbers over time are going down. And at this point in time, and this is why I give Glenn Heffernan credit. We talked about there was 486 incoming freshmen this year. And all the Division I schools said that 50% of the incoming freshmen were going to be coming from the CHL in the future. They were basically lockstep in that. Well, that still leaves basically 250 Division I freshmen to come from somewhere else. And this story here is just the USHL's way of spinning. We're going to be that next league, and not allowing saying nothing and allowing the vacuum to be filled by the BCHL or the North American League or some other entity. And that's why, even though it's factual, but it's fiction if you think it's going to be factual moving forward, that I'm assuming it's Glenn, credit for coming out with something like this. And I bring this up because this is exactly what we've been waiting for from the NCAA. Tell us why you're great. Tell us why players need to be here. Tell us what the rules are. Control the narrative. And at least Glenn and the USHL and their board of directors, on the same week that they're being threatened to be sued, are coming out and trying to drive the narrative. So, ribbon for Glenn Heffernan this week. Not a participation ribbon. He's in there. He's battling. I love it. Good on you, Glenn.
People are throwing pots and pans in the kitchen, and he's got to come out and let the guests know that everything's fine.
I mean, good on him. Let's pivot. Let's talk about the OHL and their execution that we predicted. And this is going to be a quickie because we're just going to keep checking every box real quick here and get on to the next thing. But we predicted what the CHL was going to do. Get all the best 16 and 17-year-old North American players. Well, a whole bunch of people have walked with their feet already. Okay? And we'll talk about when the next clear dates are, because it's a real quiet period right now. But you can check the box there. Keep the best 16 and 17-year-olds through their 19-year-old year. Well, you can see who Division I is committing to right now. They're committing to kids who are going to primarily come into their league as 21-year-olds or 20-year-olds. So it tells me that they're not getting the best 18 and 19. Division I is not getting the best 18 and 19-year-olds. Now, we'll come back to that in a second. But check that box. Eliminate scholarship liabilities. Okay, so they're under contract right now for these liabilities. They're going to pay those out. But we already know that they're changing their scholarship program where it's going to be you play for us 1 year, you get 1 year of schooling, and you only collect on that if you play with us through your junior eligibility. So as time goes on, they're going to eliminate those liabilities. Recruit the best Europeans. I don't know if you watch Darren Drager's podcast at all with Ray Ferraro, but they were talking about this before about if you take a look at the NHL draft right now, it's being dominated at the high end by Americans and Canadians, and America and Canada are fighting for that number one spot right now. But what he said was they're separating themselves from Europe. And they're suggesting that a lot more Europeans are going to be coming over to the CHL. And it makes sense because we talked about this before. If all the best Americans are coming up, why wouldn't the best Europeans? So we're going to give them a half check mark right there. Assistance from NHLPA agents. This is an interesting one. Agents want to get paid as quick as they can, and agents are working both sides of the fence right now. Yes, they're friends with NCAA schools. Yes, they're friends with CHL schools. They're trying to get money for kids who would never usually get money, who are aging out, no money. We're really going to find out if the agents are who their true friends are when the CHL season ends. Because as we talked about before, anybody who's on a CHL roster who's a 17 or 18-year-old right now is not going to say they're leaving next year for the NCAA until after their season is over. So we got to kind of have to put a hold on this to see what's going to happen, to see if the NHLPA agents are the friends of the CHL. Mark, you'll love this comment. I'm going to tell you who the NHLPA agents really care about. You want to take a guess who that is, Mark? They care about themselves. That's all they care about.
He didn't want to say it, but he knew the answer.
That's all they care about. They're just going to make money. Expansion. They get a big check mark here. I mean, we just got talking about Youngstown, Muskegon. I think there's a team going out in Newfoundland in the Quebec Maritimes Junior League. There's more coming down the chute here. And monetization, well, if it's true they're getting $16 million, I mean, start the process right there. I mean, and if it's true that they're going to be getting rid of scholarship liability, I mean, man, this is right now looking at a slam dunk. And I'll come back for the CHL, and I'll come back to this. And I said this day one of pod one. This is just a fight for the 17 and 18-year-old elite hockey players between, can the CHL keep them until they're 20, or does Division I go in and get them so that they're true freshmen or true freshmen plus a year? That's all this is. Okay? That's where the fight has to be. And we're going to find that out very shortly. So let me just skip here again. Well, comments on any of that? Anybody want to push back on any of those CHL checklists here?
No, I think the only thing, and I don't want to get out in front of another podcast where we're going to talk about non-NCAA hockey.
Whoa. We're going to talk about, Dan, Lucas,
Is that a commitment? Did he just put his own USHL letter into the world?
We will be evaluating your
You mentioned it when you introduced me that you'll have me on again when we talk about non-NCAA.
He outsmarted me. I tried to outsmart him, and he's much smarter than I am.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
So I don't want to get out in front of it here, but when you bring up the fact that 458 freshmen, right, for D1, every single year coming out of the U.S., there's over 30,000 young men and women looking for a place to play in college, right, from youth, high school, prep school, juniors. The top of the pyramid is tiny. It is incredibly thin. So the fact that we're talking about 458 freshmen for D1, when you have this massive amount of talent that's out there looking for places to play, I mean, it's an interesting conversation to have when we're evaluating a very, very small segment of the population.
So let's talk about those key dates. I've really kind of blown up our agenda, haven't I, Lucas?
I mean, I will say this, is we've gotten through like 3 talking points, but we have hit that golden hour mark. And I think that's what happens when you get someone with Mark's experience on here. He's able to add more than just carrot top jokes. He's able to actually dive into the issues, and it's been fantastic.
Okay, let's do this. We're going to have a little bit of fun today, coming up with OHL realignment. We'll push that to the next pod. We'll push to the next pod the Youngstown, Muskegon, and development team rosters, and taking a look at, will they be able to retain the players on their rosters that have already been drafted into the CHL. So Muskegon and Youngstown are a little bit different than the development program, because Youngstown and Muskegon are actually going into the OHL. So those players that are on their rosters are property right now of CHL teams. So we'll dive into that next pod, and we'll take a look at some examples, because there are some very, very good players there. The development team's a little bit different, and we'll go down that road. Let's end it on this. Let's talk about those dates I was referring to earlier. The second week in April is when the CHL drafts start. The OHL draft is the second week in April. Then I think the WHL draft and the Quebec Maritime League does their draft after the Memorial Cup, the very beginning of June. It's going to be a lot of our questions will be answered as to whether Americans are going to go to the CHL and play hockey when you see those drafts. Because typically if you had a really good American, but he wasn't sure that he was going to go to the CHL, so he was for sure a first-round pick, somebody would pick him in the 9th round and try and keep swinging at him until he came over. If you see the first, second, and third round of these drafts being blown up by Americans, you're going to know the foot race is like it's over.
Mm-hmm.
You know right there and then. So we've got this quiet time until the drafts. The second quiet time we have is going to end March 23rd. And it's going to go through the first week in June. March 23rd is when the CHL regular seasons end. So some of the teams don't make the playoffs. If what we've been talking about, some of their 17 and 18-year-olds who are NHL draft picks or to be NHL draft picks or just good players who weren't NHL draft picks start saying, I'm leaving the CHL as a true freshman, 18-year-old for next year, or a true freshman plus a year, and they start bolting, man, that's going to be the buzz around the CHL playoffs. They're going to be playing their playoffs, and all the crap that Division I hockey has been eating, okay, through the course of this year, some of it their own fault because they haven't driven the narrative, the CHL will eat during their playoffs. And as teams get eliminated, think about this for a second. Let's say those 20 teams that don't make the playoffs, they lose a bunch of players. Well, now you've got another 20 teams that are going to be eliminated in 2 weeks. And how fast could these dominoes fall? How fast could the peer pressure affect players and their decisions? How fast could the negotiating be for nil deals with all of these Division I schools? So it's quiet right now, but it's going to speed up in 7-8 weeks. And that's going to be fun. So, Mark, thank you for coming on today. Your expertise, really good. We are going to talk about Tier 3 hockey at some point in time and the trickle down. It's just difficult to talk about the trickle down until you know what's really happening at the top, right? Yeah. And that's why we've kind of pushed it to this point in time. I will say this about Tier 3. God, it's hard to believe, but there's more expansion. I mean, it just keeps getting bigger, and they need more players. So we'll talk about that. Lucas, I'm going to let you decide what the fine is for Dan K not being on episode 8. We'll have a board meeting in the sunshine in Florida.
Yep.
And he'll have to bring his checkbook.
Yeah,
fair
I
enough.
I think that I put forth a pretty decent effort here, and maybe you draft me to replace Dan.
I think that as the person in charge of the lower thirds, maybe your lower third changes to Dan K magically for the back half of this podcast. Could be, maybe.
I think Mark did a hell of a job, and I think there's room to grow.
Absolutely.
Mean, if we're looking at a figure skating contest, I mean, out of the chute, I can't give you a 10. I gotta give you something a little lower than that to keep you going. So
that's fine. As long as I hit your compulsories, I'm fine.
Lucas and I will discuss it. Maybe we'll allow Dan to come in. But great job, and we'll see everybody in a couple of weeks.
See everybody then. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Mark.